this on? Good morning, everyone. Okay, we're just going to get started now. I think we're at time. I just want to say welcome to the Symposium on the continued role of underwater acoustics in marine life monitoring and mitigation for the offshore wind industry. My name is Sharon Whitesell. I'm the marine mammal and protected species biologist at Ørsted. I'm here with my colleague, Ariana, who is our regulatory affairs lead, and we're going to be moderating the session today. The goal of this session is really to explore how acoustics and acoustic technology continues to remain relevant and an integral tool to support offshore wind development, both in understanding potential impacts to protected species, but also in mitigating those impacts to ensure that we continue to build offshore wind responsibly. Although passive acoustics is dominant in these areas, there is a role for active acoustics too, and we'll hear more about that in a bit. Monitoring technology is evolving at a rapid pace, and acoustic technology is no exception. From advances in data collection platforms such as autonomous vehicles to innovative sensors, it's exciting to see how these innovations are revolutionizing how we are collecting and processing data. We have 4 speakers today, and I'll quickly introduce them now, and then I'll invite them each up in turn to give their presentations. So we have Josh Kohut from Rutgers presenting on eco-gliders. We have Joe Warren from Stony Brook presenting on active acoustic technology for monitoring fish and zooplankton. We have Susan Parks from Syracuse presenting on using acoustic tags to gain insights in acoustic behaviour of large whales. And finally, we have Vince Premus from Thayer Mahan presenting on the use of acoustic arrays for monitoring vocalizing whales. So following all 4 presentations, we will have a Q&A session similar to the discussions and presentations yesterday. So just remember to enter your questions into the app, and we will endeavour to ask as many as we can. So without further delay, I invite Josh up to the stage to kick us off with his presentation on his work with gliders. Thank you.
Wow, I haven't even started yet. Don't clap yet. Thank you, and thank you for organizing this panel. So my name's Josh Kohut. I'm a professor at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. We're presenting on this tool that we're using. I want to give you some background on the tool and also some of the technologies that we're integrating on that tool. I put 3 names on there because a lot of the work is led at Rutgers by projects myself, Grace Saba, and Travis Miles, and I couldn't fit enough many's on this slide because there is a whole host of people that actually make it happen, right? All I do is miss emails and go on Zoom calls, right? They're the ones that are actually putting them in, and it's not just Rutgers. I highlight some of the partners that have been really key in how we have developed this technology and the use, particularly to offshore wind. To give you a sense of the team, this is the best way I could do it. This is a snapshot of our group at Rutgers. We're part of the Center of Ocean Observing Leadership, and it's through this team that I'm able to share some of the things that we're doing. It's a team made up of, I like to say, advanced career, not senior career for folks like me, mid-career, junior career or early career professionals, and also our students, right? We purposely use Snapshot because we're really proud of the opportunities that we give our students to work on some of these, and I want to underscore the importance of workforce development in this activity and getting students involved in this really cool tech that has application for real decisions in the environment that we're talking about here. So what are the decisions, right? Glenn would be very upset with me that I had the word baseline on the title of this slide, so don't tell him, right? But I'm of the school of thought with him that this is a very dynamic environment, right? And within that dynamic environment, there's an equally dynamic ecology. And we have a challenge to try and figure those things out on the research side and how that understanding can inform a dynamic planning process associated with offshore wind. The tool that we use is the glider. This is not a new tool. This is an autonomous system that drives forward based on buoyancy. So it's not a propeller-driven system. This is buoyancy. It literally makes itself heavy and light, and it glides, what I would call it a glider, up and down in the water column. Very energy efficient, so it can have durations of 30 to 400 days, depending on how you configure it and how many batteries you throw into it. and how many sensors you put on the glider. It gives near real-time information. It doesn't get seasick, so we can put it into any situation, and it usually calls back, even more reliable than my teenage children. And it has mission-specific payloads. This has been decades of development, right? We first started working with gliders in the 90s. I was a student at the time, and the task was getting it back, right? Could we put this robot in the ocean and get it back, right? As we evolved through the decades, we started putting more importance on the sensors, right? What are those sensors that we can integrate? We started with the quote-unquote easy ones, right? Physics in terms of a CTD and bio-optics, so we could get measures of particles from optical backscatter in the ocean. We could also look at fluorometers, so we could get some estimate of what biomass might be at different phytoplankton biomass. And there were even some sensors that went a little above and beyond that, beyond just concentration, but could we discern species? There were some other optical things. But then as we got into the 2010s, we started to move into different parts of the ecosystem, starting with chemistry. So working with state agencies and federal agencies, integrating dissolved oxygen sensors onto these robots. Grace led an effort working with industry and government partners to incorporate pH and other measures to get at some of the carbonate chemistry processes that happen in the coastal ocean. And then partnering with other groups, could we bring acoustic telemeters? Our first mission, it was like, there is no way you're going to put a glider out with a telemeter and a tagged fish is going to be within 500 meters of your glider. I think the first mission we had 12 detections. Right? So it's a platform of opportunity to start to do that. But now what I'm going to focus on as we get into the 2020s is even going further up the food web, and that's where we bring in the acoustics, both passive and active acoustic systems that we can now integrate onto these gliders. And that space is really exciting right now on the marine technology side. And I'll put a shameless plug wearing my Marine Technology Society hat. The Tech Cafe, and there's also a mini tech surge tomorrow that's going to talk about some of this, but the Tech Cafe will have some of these technologies there, and you'll be able to see them tomorrow evening. So first, passive acoustics. I'm going to give a couple examples, very offshore wind-focused examples. The first is a project that we initiated in 2019, a partnership that Ørsted brought together on their Ocean Wind 1 project off New Jersey that connected Woods Hole, URI, ourselves, and Axiom to integrate one of Mark Baumgartner's Demon systems onto the glider, as well as a stationary buoy that Mark deployed to start to look at oceanographic conditions and detections of these marine mammals of interest in and around the lease area. So you can see the pretty poor coastline of New Jersey. It's more exciting than that. But you can see the lease area and then some of the sections that we did out. And so the goal here was to see if we could get concurrent detections of marine mammals, but also as a physical oceanographer, we want to make sure we get the ocean environment. So we can see and maybe draw some understanding of what the whales know about this environment and why they're where they are. Right? So an example of how this worked, this is one of those missions. This was a February mission. On the plot on the left, you can see the path that the glider took. The red dots are confirmed detections of North Atlantic right whale. I'm going to highlight results from 2 of those detections. It's always interesting as a physical oceanographer to see detections that are the same distance from the coast, days apart, right? Because most variability in our area changes as you move offshore. There are changes along the coast, but most of it is as you move offshore. So when we see a pattern like this, it's like, oh, something might be there. So we look at the data. We can first look at the data from the glider. Up top in the middle is a section of temperature. So the warmer colors are warmer water. The colder colors are colder water. And as the plot moves from left to right, that's time. So you can see the time of the first detection. I label it as a vertical line 1, and the second detection, vertical line 2. You can see those detections span a warmer water layer, right? That in this time in February is really well mixed from surface to bottom, right? All the changes that we see are as we move side to side, not up and down. This would be a very different picture in July. So we don't just have the glider. We have an ocean observatory in the Mid-Atlantic Bight. Glenn shared some of the data from that in his plenary. We have a lot of data about what the ocean environment is doing over all the times when these surveys, and by the way, other surveys have happened. The plot on the bottom is a plot that shows surface currents from our HF radar network that Maricou's, the regional I use for the Mid-Atlantic, operates. And that shows that inshore of those two detections is weaker, less organized flow, and offshore we get this more organized, stronger flow to the southwest. So there's a change in the velocities as we move across. And then this is a satellite product developed by Matt Oliver at the University of Delaware, and that product shows where changes in temperature and color align. And we can see this front in color and temperature. So we're seeing things align in these data. We can start to make some inferences. I can't say today that, oh, these whales are looking at these fronts. But we have some data that we can now go further explore and try and understand a mechanism for that. Two other examples are very project-specific. So this is a project at the South Fork Wind with Ørsted and JASCO as a partner, where we put a JASCO hydrophone on a glider, and we were flying a very specific mission to the lease area to detect cod spawning during their boulder remover operations in March of 2023. This is another project partnering with Leading Light Wind and Invenergy, and a partnership with Invenergy and Energy Re, where we were trying to target an area that has not been sampled as well on the outer shelf near their lease area. And I give an example of where we detected a right whale, and you can see how we can match very detailed data of what was going on in the ecosystem. So you can see changes in temperature about aligned where that detection is, and it's also matched with changes in chlorophyll concentration. The final projects that I'm going to talk about are two state projects. These are funded by NYSERDA, as well as the New Jersey RMI program, which is co-run by the Department of Environmental Protection and the Board of Public Utilities in New Jersey. These are exciting programs that are allowing us to get routine seasonal coverage of the coastal ocean, right? So we're not specific to a project. This is broad data that is publicly available. As soon as the glider surfaces, it gets publicly posted, right? So these are data that are available. These gliders are heavily instrumented, right? In fact, for the RMI project, we have 2 gliders going out because one's not enough for the sensors that we're putting on it, right? And so the New York project is a joint partnership with Stony Brook and Woods Hole. The New Jersey project is Rutgers and Woods Hole, partnering with BPU and DEP. And these are the range of sensors. So the active acoustics that we're adding to these are focused on fish and zooplankton. So we have different frequencies. And we're deploying those at different times of year, depending on what the primary prey are for the marine mammals. So we're focusing on zooplankton in the winter and spring, and we're focusing on fish in the summer and fall. This is what it looks like. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but it's pretty awesome to get a detailed seasonal time series. You can see, oh, it messed it up. That's not temperature, E, it's temperature. But you can see over the different times of year, the missions that we've run, you can see that we're getting the seasonal transition from mixed to stratified to mixed. We're also capturing events like upwelling events, like coastal storms. We're also capturing events like low DO and changes in pH associated with this. And we can see actually in the dissolved oxygen where we had a very low unusual event. The final slide is looking at the zooplankton, right? This is what the active acoustic gets us. We get very detailed transects relative to the marine mammal detections and relative to all the oceanographic parameters, not just physical, but phytoplankton and chemical sensors as well. And we can start to look at relations between these features and the distribution of zooplankton relative to their predators. So in summary, ecogliders are providing a seasonally resolved 3D view from the physics all the way up through the food web. I intentionally say that because I'm a physical oceanographer, right? You could also go the other way. But what we want to do with this is we want to look at seasonal habitat use, right? We want to try and understand what are the physical processes, get to the mechanisms, right? But we're getting the data that's publicly available so we can start to explore different features that might go into other modeling efforts, right? To try and understand the distribution of these animals. And we want to contextualize the potential impacts that we might see from a wind farm activity from the variability that you heard from Glenn firsthand yesterday in the plenary and that we're observing with these tools. And so I will finish there and thank you for the time.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. My name's Joe Warren. I'm the home field advantage speaker. I'm at Stony Brook, although I'm usually based about an hour east of here at the Southampton campus. Before I jump into active acoustics, which Josh sort of touched on, I think most of us in the room and all of us up here are big proponents of all of these tools are complementary techniques, and they benefit by leveraging what this does really well with what that tool does really well with what that tool does really well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for these tools to be applied en masse. So why do we want to use sound to study fish or zooplankton or things in the ocean? There's no better tool to rapidly monitor the large volume of water that we have in the ocean. Sound travels really efficiently, and you can insonify the whole ocean from top to 6 kilometers down in a matter of seconds. Hopefully, or we here on the shelf are working much shallower. We can ping very rapidly, so we can resolve animal movements at the individual level. If we leave our instruments out there long enough, we can look at seasonal or interannual variations. And in some cases, we can even get behavior of animals in addition to things like abundances or indices. I'm going to focus on an instrument called Scientific Echo Sounder, which is sort of the main tool my lab has used for 20-odd years now. There are other systems. Acoustic Doppler current profilers can be used to get information on biology in some cases. Acoustic telemetry is another tool. But scientific echo sounders are the proven tool that's been used to study and quantify marine resources like fish for decades. So the NOAA fisheries, I think it's 8 of the 10 largest fish stocks, use acoustic surveys as part of their stock indice assessment program. So this is widely used for fish. So active acoustic systems are pretty simple. There's an orange thing. Sometimes it's painted black, sometimes it's yellow, called a transducer. That's an underwater speaker and microphone. So we tend to send out a pulse of sound from that. It travels through the water column and bounces off stuff. And then that same transducer listens for the echoes that come back from that stuff. And then somebody like me does a bunch of math and physics and hopefully converts that to some biology measure. And then there's a transceiver that basically does some signal processing. You can deploy these things in a variety of water column depths. The area you're trying to measure will affect what frequency of sound you use, and different organisms scatter sound with different efficiencies at different frequencies. So there's not like one unit that you could use in every ecosystem to study every animal. Things need to be designed for the region and the habitats and the organisms that you're interested in. So Josh showed some really nice pictures of the Rutgers Eco Gliders. These instruments traditionally were hull-mounted on ships and drove around. Now we can have robots that drive around, but we can also put them out in fixed locations, moorings, bottom landers, and I'll show you some data from projects that we've done in the Gulf of Maine and here locally in the New York Bight. We can get real-time data from these instruments, but it's just a question of sort of infrastructure and money and logistics. But the technology exists to get data back in real time. So what can we do? We've had a project going for several years here in New York where we run transect lines out to the shelf break, and we can look at the backscatter that occurs there, and so we can see geographic variations in organisms. That I think is 38 kilohertz, so that's probably fish abundance. And then we can look at how that varies seasonally. So we have the same transect in the right panel showing different times of the year, and we can look at how backscatter changes. What's really exciting for me in this field is sort of within the last 2 decades, we've had 2 major shifts. We've developed autonomous systems, or the manufacturers have developed autonomous systems that can operate independently, and we've shifted from having to use multiple frequency systems to get spectral information. So I said different scatter sounds differently with different frequencies, which is not very eloquently phrased. But basically, if you have 2 or more frequencies, you can differentiate and identify in some cases what the animals that are bouncing the sound are. We're really good at things like fish versus small crustaceans. Some cases we can do small crustaceans versus large crustaceans. But there are some fish species that we're never going to be able to distinguish from acoustic backscatter because they're the same size, they have the same swim bladder, so it's not going to be a panacea. In many situations, it's a great tool, but not for everything. So historically, like when I did my thesis, if we wanted to get data at multiple frequencies, we had to have 4 systems, more space, more real estate. But we are slowly catching up to the best active acousticians on the planet, which are the Adonisites, or the beaked whales. I really like this slide because this shows a Blaisdell beaked whale, the broadband nature of some of its clicks. And then this is a relatively new transducer from Kongsberg. We're not as good as the beaked whales, but we're approaching them in the bandwidths. And so now with even a few frequencies, I can get that spectral information, which helps us identify some of those targets. And so I'm just going to show you some data. This is a lander, a bottom lander that we have out at Sunrise Wind. So the instruments on the seafloor, we're looking up. We're in 50 meters of water. This is the sea surface. And this is, I think, about 48 hours of data. So we see diel movement patterns up and down of animals. And we can look at in the purple circle is a really strong scattering aggregation. We got a lot of energy back from that. And this green is not as much energy. And we can actually look at the spectra, and from the spectras, they have the same shape. So they're probably a similar type of animal. They're both likely fish. But we know that red blob is a few larger fish because the spectra, the backscatter echoes are stronger, and then that green blob is an aggregation of smaller fish. So we can quantify numbers of animals at a meter or sub-meter vertical resolution, and so we can actually do abundance estimates pretty well. Here's another example where we had, again, a deep layer. If you're wondering why it looks kind of segmented, this instrument's on for about 2 minutes every 30 minutes. So animals, it doesn't look continuously like some echograms because it's off for 28 minutes and animals are moving. So we've got this really strong scatterer signal moving vertically here. We've got another layer down here. If we look at those, that bottom's consistent with the fish aggregation. This is definitely a marine mammal. I don't know if it's a baleen whale or pilot whales or dolphins, but it's definitely a marine mammal. There's no fish that scatters that much sound. We can look at individual organism behavior. So here's, again, several days of data. We can do single target detections, and then we can plot those detections in 3 dimensions, and we can connect the lines. And so we can actually estimate direction if we have a compass on the lander, and velocities of animals. So we can look at behavioral responses to pile driving or storms or anything else. And in some cases, we can do a pretty good job on remote tax identification. This is some work that Brandon Luca from my lab, a recent PhD graduate, did. These black lines represent a trawl that we did, and in that trawl, we caught juvenile hake, we caught some squid, and we caught some large hake. We could use the spectral information from our backscatter, and so the purple targets down here are the large hake. The black dots represent either squid or crustaceans, so we had some of them up near the surface as well as deep, and then the orange dots are things that are similar to juvenile hake. So we've had some landers out in the Gulf of Maine for the last couple of years on a Navy monitoring project. I'm going to show you just some data here. We've had about a year of data at a couple different sites, similar systems. Again, we can do single target fish tracking. We can plot those. For this data set, all those fish were swimming in the same direction, moving mostly horizontally, 5 to 15 centimeters per second. So we can look at how that varies with other stimuli or other factors. Here's a year of data in Wilkinson Basin. Our lander's at about, I think, 140 meters deep. And so we can see the seasonal progression of the spring bloom. And then we actually see some fish coming in here at depth. And we can look at multiple frequencies over, this is a month of data, so we have that diel migration pattern. This is the next month, so we can see that there were more organisms in the water column in April than in March. And we can compare sites. Wilkinson Basin had orders of magnitude more scattering, more biomass than the Northeast Channel, which is not surprising, but we can actually quantify that and how variable it is. And one thing that I think is important is, we see a lot of variability at the mesoscale. And when we go out on boats, we're out there for a few days or a week at a time. And so having this continuous data really provides some context for those snapshots we get from vessel-based surveys. We have started to do some preliminary classification and trying to identify different types of scatterers. It's really hard. If the New York Bight was located in Antarctica, it'd be great, because we have krill and we have ice fish, and it's like really simple, and maybe a penguin swims by. Here we have copepod, we have krill, we have squid, we have butterfish, we have hake, we have bunker, we have herring, we have all sorts of things. And so it's pretty complicated, but we're getting to where we can be confident in some of these classifications. And the last thing I'll just talk about is these bottom landers. We have one located at Sunrise Wind Site. We have one or two just off New York State for a state monitoring project. We're going out next week to hopefully get them back. This is a paradigm shift in how we have sampled the ocean. We're used to driving around in a boat and mapping things in space. Now we're sitting still and seeing how things change over time. And so we as a field are still trying to figure out how to deal with that, with things like, is the same water mass sloshing back and forth? But we can get some really great information. These are schools of bunker, possibly herring, and then this is copepod scattering layers doing vertical migration. This is a humpback whale, most likely. That's the 7 meters long that came down to check out our echo sounder. And then we have data during Hurricane Lee and Tropical Storm Ophelia, again, where Josh's robots will be out there, but nobody is going to be out there on a boat doing sampling. So thanks for your time, and happy to answer questions afterwards.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I was testing it. There we go. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Vince Premus with Thayer Mahan Oasis. And right away, I want to start off. I feel bad after seeing Josh's first slide. What a great team picture. Like, it's just me on the title slide here. I kind of feel sad. I don't know if we're dialed in online with people remote, but my colleagues at Oasis and Thayer Mahan, I don't have the team picture. I got to do a better job of that in the future. Because honestly, at Oasis, there are about 10 scientists here up in Lowell, Mass. And then down in Groton, at the parent company, there's approaching a team of 200 scientists, engineers, and business development folks down there that are responsible for that work. So it's really quite a large team. Try to emulate Josh's effort in the future when we brief this work. So I'm going to talk about some observations over the past year or so on the use of hydrophone arrays for passive acoustic monitoring. And in particular, I'm going to focus on some measurements made last summer in August at Ørsted's South Fork Wind construction area. So just a little overview here. I'm not going to dive into the details of hydrophone arrays. We've done that recently in some briefings, like at the DCLDE conference last month in Rotterdam, and we've had some occasional meetings with BOEM and NOAA over the last several months. And I'm also happy to talk to people offline if they want to dive into the science of it. But allow me, just for the purposes of today, to assert that hydrophone arrays are really quite capable. It's a technology that's been around for some time. They really do two things. They achieve spatial noise rejection and the capacity to resolve baleen whales or whatever source or target of interest that you have from the anthropogenic noise that's out there. In the continental shelf environment, where most of this offshore wind work is happening, because of array gain, you're going to realize about anywhere from a 3 to 10 times detection range advantage with the kinds of arrays that we're using here, which of course translates into on the order of 10 to 100 times the area coverage. So they're quite capable. We have embedded processors and software, like many people do, that are doing other applications on other platforms that processes the detection and classification functionality. And that work gets exfiltrated or transmitted shoreside to PSOs and analysts via satellite comms. And then finally, with our fields, as we're doing right now with RevWind, we have 4 systems that are deployed. if you have overlapping detection footprints, you have the opportunity to localize by simply cross-fixing detections on concurrent arrays. So it's, I think, quite a capable system. So a little bit of history before I dive into some of the observations. OASIS has been at this for some time. Back in the early 2000s, like 2005, 2006 timeframe, we were working on integrating towed arrays into UUVs, like the Premus UUVs, for ONR under the Persistent Littoral Undersea Surveillance Program. That work led eventually, actually I should say, even before that, predating that work, we were doing work with gliders. And then during the ONR phase, say 2006 to 2010 or 12, the glider phase kind of went to sleep on us, but then got resurrected more recently with some work we're doing with the University of Washington and St. Laurent in particular, trying to bring that capability back to buoyancy gliders like the Slocum G3 that you see pictured here in the bottom left. And then in the late 2010s, finally getting connected with Thayer Mahan, and eventually part of Thayer Mahan, OASIS was acquired by Thayer Mahan in 2020. We brought this capability to bear on USVs like wave gliders, liquid robotics wave glider, like you see pictured up here in the top right. And then finally the Sea Picket system, which is a seabed-mounted variant of this capability that's really been the foundation of our passive acoustic monitoring work for Ørsted in the offshore wind arena. So let me go to this next slide, and I honestly could spend the entirety of the talk just talking about this slide. This is a result of an acoustic measurement made last summer, August 1st, where we towed one of our 32-channel towed arrays with a Sea-Track USV. So this is not a sea picket measurement, but it's an array measurement nonetheless. We were operating in the vicinity of one of the South Fork installations, trying to get measurements of the noise distribution with our arrays, and understand a little more deeply what's going to be the impact to passive acoustic monitoring and detection and classification of right whales in particular. So you see here two spectrograms that are pictured. The top one is a beam, and what I mean by beam is just steering the beam response off the line of sight to the pile, maybe 90 degrees off of the line of sight to the pile. So at a portion of beam space where we're now looking away, we're filtering, spatially rejecting that noise from the pile driving activity. And you can see that features that are present in the data are clearly detectable. What we did do, this was August, so clearly right whales are not present in southern New England in the August timeframe. So we took the liberty in our post-processing to do a signal injection analysis where we took upcalls from the St. Andrews database and injected them coherently into the array element data to get a sense of what it would have looked like if we were measuring actual animals at the same time. The bottom spectrogram shows you what a single hydrophone might have measured. We're using just one of the hydrophones from our array. And you can see, I mean, the difference is quite apparent. The single hydrophone is really masked by the pile driving noise. I can assure you that the level of the injected upcall is the same in both pictures. And now I'm going to, I don't know if this is going to work or not. I thought I tested it before. I just can't find the mouse. I should have tested finding the mouse. Where you can see it up there? Oh, wow, look at that. So let me see if this will go. So that's the pile driving data at the single hydrophone. You could barely hear a hint of the upcall. It's a 10-second snippet that's centered at the 30-second time mark in the data. Now let me play for you. Oh, I gotta look up here. The beamform result. Much quieter, and the upcall clearly stands out. So that's just a very quick listen to one example, but I think that that's a nice illustration, to go with the visual of how the array works to improve the detectability of that signal in the presence of this noise. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about detection range projections. And there's been a lot of talk about stuff like this over the last several months. I think Mark is doing a session later today where we're talking about assessing the viability of some of these different approaches. So I'm just going to show you, this is the end result of sonar equation analysis that we typically do at OASIS, where we combine an assumption about the source level, measurement of the noise, and in this case I'm using the beam relative bearing dependent noise measurements that we're working with South Fork. an assumption or measurement of our recognition differential of our software, 5.5 dB, and rolling that all up into a transmission loss that translates to a figure of merit. What nets out of the sonar equation treatment is a figure of merit that represents the transmission loss that your system can tolerate and yield the desired operating point that your recognition differential is associated with. So the detection contours I show here, the orange contour is what we get out of the array using beam noise that came from measurements during pile driving. The blue contour, which you can see is clustered right in the center there, and the green is where the array is located. That's the detection contour that's associated with the single hydrophone. So you can see that the array is providing quite a bit of capability. The array is also impacted when you look along the line of sight to the pile. The array, you're basically like looking into the sun at that point. There's really not a lot that the array can do. But as you steer slightly off of the line of sight to the pile, roughly 20 degrees off the line of sight, you start to recover that detection performance. And roughly 70%, I'd call it, of beam space is restoring the detection performance that you'd like to see, whereas the single hydrophone is just going to be completely limited at all bearings. It has no ability to spatially resolve. So now the next sequence, I've got a sequence of 3 here where I'm going to use more realistic source level, but the noise measurement that's the baseline for this detection contour is the prior to the onset of the hammer strikes happening. This, looking at it this way, was really a consequence of nice discussions we've had with folks at BOEM and NOAA, folks like Nick Sisson up in Gloucester, Morgan Martin and Alex Conrad at BOEM encouraged us to take a look at, with the view towards area clearance, if you use the noise distribution, not necessarily while the hammer strike is happening, but just prior to onset, where you might be trying to be aware before the hammer strike starts, are there any whales in the vicinity of the operation? And use that noise measurement that's associated with the ships that are supporting the operation, because they're really quite noisy, as many of you know, quite a bit noisier than typical shipping vessel transit noise that's going to happen in normal conditions in that area. So the first contour here is for a source level of 172, and you can see to the southeast where the TL transmission loss is quite favorable, the performance of the array is really quite good, in excess of 35 kilometers. The single hydrophone does better than it did during the hammer strike, but it's struggling to meet the 10-kilometer detection range in all directions. When we go to something a little more reasonable, like 165, now the single hydrophone is limited to just barely 5 kilometers. And then finally, when we step down to 160, which is maybe on the lower side of the published, in the open literature, published range of source levels for the right whale. Of course, both are impacted, but here the single hydrophone is really struggling to even make the 2 kilometers. So just to give you an idea of the modeling projections, what we think we see in terms of the difference between the array and the single hydrophone. So now I've got 2 minutes left. I'm just going to spend the last little bit of time here making a couple of remarks about the work at RevWind. We've had 4 systems operating at RevWind over the last month. I think we made it up to 4 systems by June 15th. So about half the field is driven. And we've had numerous baleen whale detections over that 6-week to 2-month time frame. Detections at ranges up to 19 nautical miles from one of the arrays. I think, to summarize, there are also some single-channel, single hydrophone systems that Ørsted has out there with one of their subcontractors that's supporting the work as well. And my understanding, talking to our analysts back at Thayer Mahan, is that by the end of last week, I think we had on the order of 300, maybe 340 detections across the field of 4 arrays, whereas the single hydrophone counterparts had, I think, on the order of 25 to 30 detections in that same time period. So about an order of magnitude difference in terms of the array relative to the single hydrophones that are out there. And we had about 35 localizations during that time period with multiple arrays detecting animals at the same time, generating the localization solution. And the final result here is just an illustration of 2 arrays working concurrently to generate such a localization solution. You can see here, I like this example because it happened during pile driving when monopile 18 was being driven on June 29th. One array detected an animal along the line of sight to the pile at a range of 1.5 miles. Another array detected it at a range of 11 miles. And the localization result that resulted, you can see that black ellipse there, was at a range, estimated range of about 8 nautical miles away from the pile, so well outside the exclusion zone for monopile 18 at the time. So just an illustration of what's possible when you've got concurrently operating arrays with overlapping detection coverage. And then finally, with that, let's see, okay. I'll just leave it here, but I'll say, I think it's fair to say, without hopefully appearing immodest, that these arrays are really starting to redefine the state of the art for passive acoustic monitoring. There's a lot of capability, and honestly, the more challenging the noise field, the higher the noise level, the more anisotropic is the noise field, the more opportunity there is for the array to distinguish itself from what I'll call the pre-existing state of the art. So I think arrays are going to continue to play an important role, especially when we want to try to do nighttime and low visibility pilot driving in the future. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Susan Parks. I'm a professor at Syracuse University, and I'm happy to sort of follow up those previous talks to also present sort of multi-decades of work by huge teams of scientists and just be the person here standing telling you about it. So I'm really going to be talking about how acoustic behavior of large whales from acoustic tagging can really inform a lot of the technology solutions to passive acoustic monitoring in the marine environment. So passive acoustic monitoring broadly is used for environmental monitoring. We heard about a couple of different methods and techniques to use passive acoustic monitoring to detect organisms in the marine environment. But what's really important to remember is that passive acoustics is only going to detect the animals that make sounds that you can detect on your system. And so there's a lot of information that's needed both on the biological side and then on the physical side to understand what the sounds are that an animal might make, and then also what you can actually detect in the environment. What are the limitations of your tool, and what are the limitations maybe of your study species that you're interested in terms of using passive acoustic monitoring. So for passive acoustic monitoring, you really need to know what are the species-specific signals that you're going to be detecting. So you're making a recording, you have lots of things in the environment. If you don't have a match between the sampling rate of what you're recording and the signal of your animal, you're not going to detect it, even if it's there. You need to know whether all animals make the signal. So if you're detecting a signal and only one sex produces that signal and they only produce it 1 month of a year, that maybe is going to be something you need to know if you're looking for it in a habitat. Not detecting the signal might just mean it's the wrong time of year or the wrong sex is present. You need to know if the signal production varies by the behavior of the organism. So these animals are in these habitats using the habitat for particular reasons, and so if they make particular sounds associated with particular behaviors, you need to have a sense of what might be available for you to sample. And you also have to know how often they make the sound. So, for example, echolocating odontocetes often are producing sounds to sense their environment, and so passive acoustics is great because you can eavesdrop on a sound they're using constantly, whereas baleen whales, like right whales that I focus on, sometimes have call rates of less than 1 call per day, which is awesome when you're trying to detect where they are. Then you also need to know how detectable the signals are. And so you just need to know something about the environment. Again, for me, for thinking about right whale examples, studying right whales in the Bay of Fundy, where it's 200 meters of water, which isn't that deep, but the detection range there compared to southern right whales in Brazil, where the water's 6 meters deep, you can detect the right whales maybe 200 meters from the source in the shallow water. So you need to know something about the physics of the environment as well. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on the acoustic tags and how we can collect data to answer all of those questions related to marine mammal species for passive acoustic monitoring, so you can figure out which signals to use and what they actually are telling you about the species that you're looking for when you detect those signals. So this is an image of a tag, just sort of breaking down the components of the acoustic tags. These acoustic recording tags were designed and first implemented with elephant seals about 30 years ago. You may be more familiar with something called the D tag that was developed at Woods Hole in the early 2000s. I just happened to be a graduate student in my first year of graduate school, the first year the D tag was being invented, so I sort of have been along for the ride for the evolution of those tags. And so these tags really give us information of the acoustics being produced by that animal and every animal nearby and everything in the environment, along with dive depth, orientation, and temperature information. So I'm going to be talking about a case study of right whales and information that we've learned from tag deployments that can be implemented and are useful for interpreting what we get from passive acoustic monitoring. And so the nice thing is, too, I've been doing this for now a long time. You can also learn new things and go back to old data to answer new questions, which is also a really great thing about archival passive acoustic monitoring as well. So there are information on species-specific calls that we've gotten from these tags. So right whales actually have a rich repertoire of sounds beyond the upcall. So I like to say that they are the elephant cow of the ocean. But mostly what you're probably used to hearing are the upcalls. And so this is sort of a signal that we often hear in the environment. So answering the question of whether all individuals produce the signal, part of the reason the upcall is used primarily for passive acoustic monitoring for right whales is based on many years of tag data collection and behavioral observations. We know that both sexes produce the upcall. We know that calves as young as 6 months old start producing the upcall in a detectable manner. And so it's a great signal that we know all individuals in the population make, and they make them in all habitats. As I said before, the call rate might be kind of low sometimes, but it is really useful in that we know that you are not going to be missing a segment of the population. The gunshot, on the other hand, which is a loud sound that I'm going to play to wake everyone up now because you're all looking a little... Okay, good. It didn't end up being as loud. This is recorded primarily from adult males, often in social groups, sometimes in solitary displays during closer to the breeding season. And so the nice thing with the gunshot is we know a male is likely present, though we do know that females can make this sound as well. But if you were using the gunshot, for example, the detection range might be much, much better, but you may be only detecting a portion of the population, and that's part of the reason it's not used extensively. Another question is whether the signal production varies by behavior. So this is taking data from 35 D-tags that were deployed in the Bay of Fundy in the early 2000s. So the y-axis is the number of tag deployments, and then the x-axis is showing you sort of the call rate per hour. Notice the one with most of the information and most of the tag data is the 0 call rates per hour. And so I have this broken down by behavioral state. So essentially, most right whales are silent while actively feeding, and this is something that I have seen now in multiple habitats. When an animal is actively feeding with their mouth open, they do not call. And so if you have an animal that's in a foraging state, the call rates are very, very low. And so, for example, in Cape Cod Bay, we've been doing observations where we know there are 8 right whales right in front of us, and our call rate is close to 0. In contrast, if you have a right whale surface active group or social group, the call rates can be super high, over 200 calls per hour, often even produced by just a single individual. We don't really have a good idea of what right whales do in Cape Cod Bay in the evening, despite many years of trying with the tags. The tags go on with suction cups, and every evening right whales make surface active groups. So if they're in the area in an aggregation, you're going to get these surface active group calls and high call rates, often at different sort of times of day associated with when maybe they've stopped foraging due to prey availability. Another thing to consider about this is how often individuals make signals might change depending on their life history and the behavioral state that they're in. So, for example, we did a study off the southeastern U.S. to try to look at calling behavior of mothers with calves with right whales. Again, I would suggest that studying an endangered species and trying to get a good sample size are not compatible. So, for example, the calving rate was really great in the early 2000s. Then we started this study and it fell off a cliff. So it took a long time to get a small sample size. But what was really striking, though, is that pregnant females that were on the calving grounds that we tagged had really high call rates. They made lots of upcalls. They were very detectable. And in one instance, a month later, we tagged the same individual after she had given birth to a calf, and there were no upcalls. They made very quiet, like whisper-type sounds that the calf likely could hear, but they just sort of totally dropped the louder calls from their repertoire. Thinking about the behavioral ecology, maybe the mothers don't really want to attract attention when they have a very small calf. So it makes sense that they might change their acoustic behavior. This isn't great trying to use passive acoustics to detect mothers with young calves, and so it's something to take into consideration. You might be missing a very vital part of the population if you're 100% relying on passive acoustics. You also need to know how detectable the signals are. So from the tags within a tag record, we can see variation in the amplitude of calls for right whales that can vary on an order of about 20 dB. So this is looking at the call intensity received on the tag on the y-axis. So this isn't the true source level because the tag is in different positions on each whale. So you could be 6 meters from the source on the whale on one whale and 2 meters from the source on another, plus we have body shadow issues. But what's important is within the same tag with the tag in the same position relative to the source source, we can see a pretty broad range of source levels within an individual over relatively short periods of time. So right whales can adjust their amplitude of their call, so if you use a single value, you're wrong. You just have to realize that you need to know how wrong you could be and sort of pad that variation. So essentially, right whales tend to make their quietest calls when the background noise is the lowest. And so when you think about background noise being a problem for detections, the right whales may also be calling more quietly when it's quiet. Similarly, the loudest calls tend to be detected in the loudest background noise conditions, and so they are to some degree compensating for the background noise. And so maybe your SNR thresholds being the same regardless of background noise might be reasonable. The tags also give us information about where the whales are in the water column when they make their calls. This also becomes really important when you're trying to estimate the detectability. So a lot of models that I've seen put right whale source levels sort of mid-water column, and right whales almost never call in the middle of the water column. Almost every call they make is in the very top 3 meters of the water column. In large part, I think that this is because the calls are used for social communication when they're not foraging, and that's usually when they're near the surface. And so from the Bay of Fundy, that 35 tag record that we had, more than 60% of the calls were produced less than 3 meters from the surface. The deeper calls tend to be in rare situations where, for example, mothers are reuniting with calves and they keep calling when they go on a dive and aren't feeding. And so it's just something to think about for every species, that you need to know all of these different pieces. So looking forward and thinking about what this means for other species, I'm focusing on right whales because I've been working with them for such a long time and we have a pretty extensive tag database. I would also say that for a lot of the species that are in some of the areas of interest for development, we have very little data or no data on a lot of the things I'm talking about which calls are the best call types, if there's differences by sex, if there's differences by age, behavior. And so it's really important to think about just a passive acoustic detection of the species. You need to have answers to some of these things to know what you're missing. So you need to identify call types to species, determine the differences by age and sex of animals that are making the calls, identify potentially quiet life stages. So are you missing mothers with calves? And that's maybe something that you want to be aware of. You need to have information on behaviors related to calling behavior to understand if the animals are likely foraging in your area. Are they likely to be more active acoustically? So humpback whales, very active when they're foraging acoustically. And then determining call parameters related to propagation. So fundamentally, data are needed for each species within the region and season of interest. And so that's maybe not great news, but realizing that you're taking information the best available from different habitats, try to at least match a foraging ground to a foraging ground if you're getting data, things like that to where you can, and try to fill in the rest as we get more data. All right, well, thanks very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks everyone for some great talks. Just invite all the speakers up to the front now and we'll just do a Q&A. Okay. So I think it was really great to see such great technology development and advances going on. First question to Joe. Could you talk a little more about your applications of quantifying movement or swimming speed? For example, yeah. For example, can you identify foraging behavior or effort based on this?
That's a good question. So one of the challenges we have with the target tracking is we currently have those instruments deployed to last a year. So in order to preserve battery life, they're only on for about 30 seconds on each frequency every 30 minutes. So, and then we've got the beam of the echo sounder, and so the further a fish is, the larger an area it can cover. So if we were trying to do foraging behavior, we might want to reprogram it. So we ran it, for like 5 minutes, but not as frequently or something. We haven't tried to do that yet, but it's certainly possible and or probable. And I think one of the great applications of this tool is we've had buoys that we can talk to via RF or cell signal, and so you can dynamically change the sampling effort. Not the ones on the seafloor, but if you had ones at the surface on a buoy or affixed to a structure, you could change that on the fly to do different types of sampling.
Great. I'm going to ask one for Josh here. Any concerns about the glider or turbine collisions if deployed after or during construction? Do the gliders have collision avoidance capabilities?
Depends on who you ask. There are some in our group that have no concerns about that, and some in our group that do have some concerns about that. So that's what makes our group a great team. I am not going to say which camp I'm in, but we are... The gliders in particular are buoyancy-driven vehicles, so they are not moving fast, right? Most babies crawl faster than our gliders move, and they're very close to neutrally buoyancy, so they're going to sort of bump up. But there are potentially snags that could happen, particularly as time goes on and there's more and more growth on the structures. So we are right now running experiments as we move through lease areas, assuming that the turbines are there and evaluating that to have more quantified answer. But if you ask some of our team, no concern. If you ask others, we need to find more. But I will say that I'm fairly confident that we can also come up with different behaviors that will allow us to be more confident as we move through the fields. There's quite a bit of control that you can put on the gliders, and you can change behavior when you're in a wind farm versus when you're out, and you can also make decisions on weather conditions or current conditions that you would do it and wouldn't do it. So yeah, that's my answer.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next question I think could be for Susan and for Josh. It seems like there are issues with using long-term tags on right whales in terms of like them not lasting very long and so on. Is there a way to task a glider with following whales around to record sounds and track movements instead?
So I'll start with why it's hard to study right whales. So they're big, and I mentioned the surface active groups, and so anyone who's tried to put a tag on a right whale knows that even if they're ones inside the right whale, they'll still break them because they just run into each other and are like rolling around at the surface, and they're whales. And so they're really hard on technology. The suction cups aren't designed to stay on because we're trying to get high resolution data. We've sort of moved to more adhesive-based attachment, and it's just looking promising. But again, that's just like days of attachment because of the questions that we're asking. And so the long-term attachment would, I think, people have had lots of ideas of how to do it because there are parts of right whales that are maybe a little more solid, like the callosities, but figuring out how to get something on there for a long time has been a challenge. But following them, I'll let Josh answer.
Yeah, right whales are too fast for a glider to follow. But one of the things we've done in Antarctica, we were partnering with Bill Fraser, who was tagging penguins, and the solution there, penguins are also too fast for a glider to keep up with. But penguins can identify, as right whales that are tagged can identify places that they find interesting in the ocean, and then we can send the glider to those places to try and learn what they know already about those interesting places. So there are opportunities for the glider to be reactive to information that we get, and there are new functionalities on the glider. There's a tool now called Backseat Driver where we can put a third processor on the glider that allows us to have machine learning, AI, or whatever program you want to actually command and adjust behavior in the glider while it's underwater, right? So it can react to different conditions or different things. So with that functionality, there's even more opportunities to have the glider be reactive to the environment that it's in.
Great. Lots of good questions here. Maybe I'll stay with Susan for a minute here. Susan, you showed that right whales mainly call within 3 meters of the surface. How does this affect detectability with hydrophones, and does it affect how deployment should be optimized? So maybe that's a question you could take for starters, and then I'd be curious to hear Vince.
Yeah, and I mean, it can also talk about
So
how it
can I
affects
just
detectability.
just remind you to speak into the microphone?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry. So it's not great for detection, but it really just depends on the sound speed profile and the water depth. And so it really is just something to take into consideration if you're doing propagation modeling and detection, that often if there's surface ducting, you could have issues where you maybe aren't detecting it sort of closer than you would expect if they're near the surface when they're vocalizing. And so I think it's just something to be aware of. And for other species, we don't see that. So for example, for tag data that we have from humpbacks, and some recent data from fin whales, we see those calls throughout the water column. And so it's just a different challenge for right whales, and it's just important to know.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, so that was one of those, Susan, I made a mental note to self, if we try to go do some at-sea source operations later this year, and at least make sure that we're deploying our sources a little shallower than we ordinarily would. But when you're within 3 meters of the surface in this band, you're almost, within a wavelength, or you're on the order of a wavelength of the surface. So with that kind of geometry, yeah, it could potentially affect detectability. Definitely should take it into account with any modeling that we do. And like I say, at-sea source operations, we might try to do quantify performance.
And I'll just add, I think it's kind of everybody in this room knows this, right? But it sort of speaks to the fact that passive acoustic monitoring is not our silver bullet, right? Like we need to also be using PSOs. We have like a lot of other capabilities that we're using to monitor for these whales during construction. So I think it's a good reminder of the importance of that redundancy.
I'll just stick with you, Vince, here. It seems that one of the challenges to acoustic localization is keeping hydrophones time synced. How do your arrays address this, especially when you're using multiple arrays that are kilometers apart?
Yeah, no, that's very good. And of course, there's work out there. We're actually, I think he's here at the meeting, John Spiesberger, working with him to look at time difference of arrival localization techniques on top of the array gain component that the arrays deliver. To get the most out of techniques like that, it really is vital that all of the arrays are time synchronized. So they all have a surface expression, so they have access to a universal timestamp, and the electronics, the payload electronics, are designed to be low drift. They're not atomic clock quality, but they don't need to be, since they have access to satellite comms. They can be updating their internal clocks as necessary. So I think in past years, early data collections, we may have some data sets where clock error was an issue, but that's no longer the case with the systems that we're deploying now.
That's good to hear.
Okay. Joe, we've got lots of questions for you, but I'm going to maybe just stick with the sort of Vince-Susan tag team here for a little while longer. Susan, what's the state of the science to understand how many individuals are vocalizing?
Okay, so this is someone who knows something about acoustic tags, I'm guessing, that asked this question. So about how many whales are vocalizing from, that was the question. Okay. So I don't know if the question is whether if we know how many whales are vocalizing during PAM recordings, or so there are a couple of different options. So on the tags themselves, we have the challenge that it's really almost impossible to differentiate between the tagged whale and a whale right next to it. And so that's one thing that we take into consideration. So it could be even worse, like it could be 2 whales and 0 call rate. And then for thinking about the array, you can localize multiple calling animals. And so then you have at least 2 if you have 2 different bearings or 3 different bearings. So you can sort of get a minimum estimate. And so I think that there are a couple of different things that you can use in terms of timing. Overlapping calls obviously means that there are 2 whales calling, but there are a lot of different, so it's sort of there are lots of different ways to try to get a minimum estimate, but I don't think passive acoustics is ever going to give you a really perfect answer because you don't know how many silent ones are there. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that you can maybe get a minimum count.
Okay, Joe, I think we'll tackle some of your questions. So, do you have any studies in the works looking at fish behaviour before, during, or after pile driving in the close sort of vicinity of that the project?
Good question. Yes, but it was kind of happenstance. So our lander went out last June at sunrise wind, which was pre-construction. And one thing I didn't mention is we put a bunch of different instruments on those bottom landers. So Susan had a passive recorder on there, and that was when they were installing the pile driving at South Fork. So one of the things I want to do is look and see if we see any differences in fish movement during those instances. We haven't done it yet, but that's one of the low-hanging fruit with that data set I want to do. So it's certainly doable, you know, and we didn't design it to do it, it just sort of happened that way. So you could design a study pretty effectively to do that.
Joe, on that note, how hard was it to pull out cod grunts from the background noise of boulder removal in that first example that you gave?
What?
Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have that wrong? Hold on.
Susan showed, didn't you? No, who showed?
No,
Oh, Josh showed cod
Oh, it
grunts.
was Josh. I'm sorry.
We've
Okay.
done cod grunts, but
Yeah. So for me, it was very easy because Jasco, our partner, did it. So they had the expertise and the ability. So our role in that partnership was to provide data to the Jasco team, and then they interpret it. So there are Jasco folks here whoever asked that question could find. I apologize, that's not my area of expertise. We drive the bus. We don't.
But the cod signal is pretty stereotypical, and NOAA has done a lot of work on it and published a detector that we've used, and Jasco may have done their own, but it's a pretty good signal to pull out as long as you don't have a lot of background noise at 50 hertz.
Yeah, and I'll just add one of the reasons why we used a glider for that survey, right? It's not as directly navigable as some of the propeller-driven vehicles that are out there, but it is quiet. Right, it's a very quiet platform because it's like coasting down a hill on a bike versus riding a motorcycle, right? So that was the reason why we chose the platform.
Okay, so this is a bit of a more broad question, and I invite any of the panelists to answer. So what does the future look like for acoustic monitoring of marine animals, and how can the monitoring be enhanced above what we're doing already now?
Well, maybe one obvious answer will be to find a way to increase the use of arrays in the continental shelf environments. I mean, I think arrays, apart from being, maybe more sensitive acoustic detection tools, just I remember having conversations like this with Chris Clark over the last couple of years, that they can be really instrumental at just generally characterizing the soundscape with some nice spatial resolution. And if we can install arrays up and down, like for instance, the Eastern Seaboard. I know there's efforts like this that are underway right now with various programs. UNH, I think, is engaged in such work, and others. But I think arrays like this kind of capability in excess of 32 channels and operating continuously, say over the period of time, 6 months to a year or year over year, we can really start to get a sense of just shipping impacts, ambient noise, and how it evolves over time, and be characterizing the spatial distribution of vocalizing animals over time. Just doing whatever we can to increase our measurement capability and understanding over a long period of time is going to be important to do.
I'll show my bias and say I think I'm particularly excited about the connections that I've made with the marine mammal and fish communities as an oceanographer, and thinking about the ways we can incorporate oceanographic observations into the monitoring that's done for these different animals so that we can learn about the ocean from them, and then in turn take that knowledge and be better stewards for them. So I'm really excited about the conversations that are happening this week that are bringing the Glens of the world to this space, and all of the experts that are in the room talking about different parts of the ecology. We have an opportunity with these technologies to really think about the system as it truly is, which is dynamic and ever-changing.
Okay, Joe, this one's for you, but also others feel free to jump in. Would you advocate monitoring impacts at the current precision of our acoustic tools? For example, monitoring changes in abundance of fish with large swim bladders instead of, or in addition to, species specific?
Yes, because I think we can quantify those things, but it's a weird conundrum because Active acoustic categorizes fish based on their scattering features, which may or may not be relevant to their ecological function. So you could have two different species of fish that get grouped together in the acoustic world, but how they operate in the ecosystem may be very different. So this is where, again, I think like the active acoustics is great, but you always have to ground truth it. So we're still going to need trawl nets or video systems or other types of information or historical data about what's there. And the other thing, kind of building off Josh's thing, is like what we're trying to do is really, really hard, right? We're trying to characterize these huge volumes of the ocean at many different trophic levels that are dynamic due to physics, they're dynamic due to biology and organism behavior. And so, a lot of the techniques that are being used here are, on the cutting edge, or they've recently become the cutting edge. And so one of the challenges, I think, is like trying to do this across the eastern seaboard would be challenging because it would require a lot of cloning of people or expansion of people's capabilities, because it's a really hard problem, and we know more about it now than we did before, but I don't think any of us would claim we're still sampling at the resolution one would love to have to actually characterize these systems.
Vince, could you speak a little bit about the deployability of your arrays and how easy they are to deploy to retrieve from small vessels?
Sure. So I'm certainly not involved in the day-to-day of deployment, launch and recovery operations, at least not like I used to be in the old days when it was really just Oasis doing this sort of thing with gliders and UUVs. But we've got very skilled teams of folks that many of them are engineers, retired Navy, retired Coast Guard, that are no stranger to complex offshore operations. So I think, the systems have undergone over the last 2 to 3 years quite a lot of hardening, quite a lot of just engineering considerations given to how to make things rugged and reliable and last for periods of time when they're exposed to sea states that are maybe not, even New England, even in good times of the year, you can get some sea states that can be pretty challenging. But I think overall, we just had a statement that I learned from one of my colleagues at Thayer Mahan that not related to the sea bottom mounted sea picket systems, but the outpost mobile systems. We've got a deployment right now where it's in excess of 90 days, which is, I don't think we've had one quite that length of time before. This is a wave glider, or not. Yeah, I think it is a wave glider. It's a surface, a USV asset towing array. I think it is wave glider based. The sea pickets, I think, like Joe was alluding to earlier, and Josh, this is new technology that we're testing and just beating them up and assessing what's the envelope of expected performance. Every month that systems are out there, we're learning more. So I think the goal eventually is to get at least to a 6-month deployment life, maybe 12 months. But I think in terms of the launch and recovery operations, they're done safely. A lot of engineering and analysis of that whole sequence of events has happened over the last couple of years to really make it pretty smooth. So knock on wood, that continues. But I think as at sea operations go, as complicated as these are, they're not as difficult to deploy as they used to be, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago.
Vince, staying with you for a minute, if there are multiple vocalizing animals in an area, how far apart would they need to be for the array to be able to tell them apart?
So that's a great question. The spatial resolution that I talk about has to do with the aperture length, the range to the animal. It's kind of like an R d theta kind of resolution, spatial resolution. So off the top of my head, I don't know that I could give a great answer to that, but I think ordinarily, detection ranges that we're probably typically talking to, let's say, 10 nautical miles, they'll probably have to be on the order of 10 or 10 degrees apart, 20 degrees apart. I think as we start to quantify performance, like I was alluding to earlier with at-sea source operations, we want to do a better job of describing that with measurement. We want to go to sea. We do this from time to time. To date, it's been more of a system shakedown kind of a thing rather than a rigorous performance quantification kind of thing. We're going to try to embark on that later this summer, maybe while pilot driving is still happening at Rev Wind, if we can get a plan that everyone is on board with. But I think that's something that really requires more at-sea calibration to really understand. For right now, I think we're just going to identify an individual or a cluster of individuals and not be able to comment too much on whether we've got multiple individuals on a certain line of bearing.
Susan, there's a couple of questions here about tag design in terms of attachment designs to whales to make, for enhancing their lifespan on the whale. Is there any, do you see any technology upcoming that is in place to kind of improve that attachment time?
Sure, yeah. So as I mentioned, the tag evolution, people have been trying to improve these tags. In the beginning, they were designed to do short 4 to 6 hour deployments because it was for targeted, controlled exposure experiments. And so that was the original design. You wanted short duration. At that time, the technology could only really record for 8 to 12 hours. Now we have capability. I had a PhD student work with these tags that were deployed on manatees and put inside the belts of animals that were released for rehab, and we have 44 days of continuous recording. So it's really a question now of finding a way to attach it to the animal and try to minimize any harm to the animal to get data for longer time frames. So I mentioned the adhesives, so that's sort of the next step is that we've tried adhesives on the tags, but we tried them initially on the suction cups that were designed for, sort of to stick them to the whales, but a suction cup is a terrible thing to glue onto a whale because essentially, as soon as you break the seal on the edge of the cup and the whales are diving, so you have a compression of the cup every dive. So we're working now on belly plates and sort of using bio-inspired design from other species to get structures that you could apply those adhesives in a way that would be much more compliant to the surface and last longer. But again, these marine mammals often slough their skin to get parasites off. And so it's going to stay on as long as the skin stays on. So there's lots of different designs. Other groups are working towards, I guess the term is minimally invasive designs that penetrate the skin but maybe not as far. I think there's been mixed results with right whales because, as I say, ones that also didn't even have surface expression that were implanted didn't last all the time because the whales are so tough on the technology. So I think it's a balance between trying to minimize any harm to this really critically endangered species versus trying to get data to help protect them. And so it's sort of a balancing act. But things are moving forward still.
All right, Joe, over to you again. Have you combined current profiling with echo sounders to get biomass flux? And if so, is that working out and is it useful?
No, but there are technologies that could be used to do that. So Nortec, maybe within the last 5 years, makes a combination ADCP echo sounder that would give you, and it's a broadband echo sounder, so that would give you the data to do that. We could kind of estimate some current velocities looking at small particles with the echo sounder, but it's not designed to do that. And there's issues because ADCPs tend to have pretty large depth bins. So if you were looking for surface currents versus deep currents, you could do that. But when we run our echo sounders in broadband mode, we have resolutions vertically of 5 to 10 centimeters. And so there's a little bit of a mismatch in the data sets. But there are technologies that could be used to do that.
Okay.
I'll just add really quickly to that and put another plug to the Nortec system. We've used it in the Antarctic, and it's awesome to get the combined ADCP and echo sounder. And the other thing I would say is ask an oceanographer, because we have data sets that are available, and it's hard for me to say this because I'm not a modeler, but there are actually some models that are pretty good that are out there, and so you could look at least sort of broad flux estimates from those models. There's a data assimilative one that's run for the last 15 years at daily time step that's pretty good. It's not as good as OBS, but it's pretty close.
Joe, if you don't mind keeping the floor for another minute, what is the attenuation of the different frequencies? How far are the signals traveling to say how close or far the animals are from the transducer?
Yeah, it depends on the frequency. So one benefit right now is all the wind lease areas in this area are in 50 meters of water, so ballpark. And so we can actually run a higher frequency system like the 333, have full water column coverage, and detect things like copepods. If you were trying to do that in the Gulf of Maine, you wouldn't get full water column coverage with a bottom-mounted system. But you can play games. If you're in deeper water, you can put multiple systems out at different depths. So it's what's the question, where are you doing, what animals are you interested in, and then you can design a system to measure that.
Cool. Speaking of what animals are you interested in, you showed an example of detecting a marine mammal with active acoustics. Does it make sense to pursue this further, and why or why not?
So our beams are really small, like they're wide, 18-degree beam widths, and in 50 meters of water, your footprint or kind of your detection range is on the order at the surface of like a 5-meter diameter circle. So you can be, and if you were running continuously, that probably wouldn't be a bad way of trying to like get things to swim through it. We're on 2 minutes every 30 minutes, so with that duty cycle, I think it's interesting, and when they do swim, we can see, are they going down, are they going up, is there food around? But it would be hard, you'd use a different system if you were gonna design that. I think you'd have a more, you'd want like a forward-looking sonar, that would probably be a better tool for that.
A question for the whole panel. Have you any thoughts on ways that BOEM or other federal partners could improve monitoring requirements or guidance related to offshore wind?
Which partners again? Say the first part again.
BOEM or other federal partners?
Federal partners.
Yeah.
I'm just clarifying.
I guess, so one of the challenges I think is, it's been hard in my experience, the BOEM requirements that they give the industry are based on sort of historical methods. And so new technologies, which have been used in some contexts for a long time, haven't been used in this context. And so I think there's been, I would like to see more adaptation of the new technologies and sort of broader, partnerships up and down the East Coast. And that, I think it's happening in some cases, but not everywhere. And so.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add, and this is not advice to any particular agency, it's more to the community, is that I saw when I was a student, and Vince made mention of it, there was rapid development of glider technologies, and they were enabled by programs that were funded by something called NOP, which was the National Ocean Partnership Program, which required teams responding to be made up of government, academic, and private partners, private sector partners. And I think it's through those kinds of partnerships that we can make that kind of progress. Because the research community may not be aware of the challenges from the industry or the challenges from the regulatory side. And so having those conversations and having places to think of what those solutions are, it only makes it happen faster and more effective.
Maybe one thing if I can. So one other thing I could add, and I think this has been a theme that's surfaced in many of the meetings that have happened over the last several months, but perhaps being a guiding force with regard to standardization of performance metrics. There's been a lot of talk about that, Vessel Strike workshop back in March, DCLD workshop in Rotterdam just last month, and meetings prior to that. NOAA and BOEM, we've been having many meetings reviewing like the viability of these new technologies, and a lot of great dialogue has been happening. And I think as people have undertaken that dialogue, they've realized that people are being rigorous about how they're quantifying performance, but perhaps not necessarily adopting standards with regard to assumptions, how things are defined, or what's the mechanism for comparing performance. If it's false alarm rate, detection range, like what do these things actually mean? Often it's like, of course, everybody knows what detection range means, but then when you really dive into the details, it's maybe not 100% clear what one person means by that by someone else. So certainly federal government and folks like BOEM and NOAA can lead that effort. I don't know that they necessarily have to stand up and declare what that standard is, but they can certainly be the moderator for that discussion, and at some point would, I think, need to aggregate the findings and try to publish something that they'd like to see everybody adhere to. But that's definitely a place where some leadership at the government level could help quite a lot.
Great. Speaking of maybe aggregating findings, for everybody, how do we encourage all these data sets to be made available for wider use so that we can use them together to gain further insights? The question asker fears a lot of this data won't be analyzed to its full potential if it remains siloed. Easy question, right?
All right, it's getting late.
So as the public university rep, I can say very confidently, all the data we collect is publicly available. We've been doing that since the World Wide Web was invented. The first time we posted our first satellite image was, we got, I think, 30 hits from an FTP server in 1994, right? So that's always been our mantra. We think that's really important, and because of exactly how the question was asked. There is more information in the data. We could turn our observatory off. Don't hear this, but we could turn our observatory off today and support research for the next 50 years. I mean, there are tremendous insights that can be gained from the data that's there, and fully endorse making it publicly available. And any of the projects that I've been involved in, regardless of the funder, has been data that's been made publicly available. Everything I showed today was made publicly available as soon as the glider came to the surface, with the exception of the active acoustics, because that takes Delphine, our amazing acoustician, to process once it's back to shore, because we can't pay those satellite bills to send that all back.
Stony Brook alum, Delphine.
Yes, right, of course. Stony Brook alum, Delphine.
Yeah, I'll just chime in as well that I think there's been also a lag with some of the acoustic data because of the size of the data sets. But in the past 5 years, there's been huge movement forward to make the tags available. So there are databases for the movement data from the tags that have been put together by the Office of Naval Research and other government agencies. And then there's also a spin-up for passive acoustic data that's being made available with open access and good metadata. It's just been slow because of the size of the data. But I think that at least from our perspective as well at Syracuse, like all the data is something, if people request it because of the size, we're always happy to share it. But I think that having these databases where people can go directly and just query the data and get it will speed things up a lot. So I think that's great.
Maybe I'll add one quick thing. I mean, certainly quite a large part of the reason, because of, as Susan points out, I mean, these data sets are really large, especially when we're talking about 32 channel arrays that are sampling acoustic telemetry at, roughly 2-3 kilohertz. But I think, we've certainly benefited, as many of folks in this room have benefited from the availability of public databases. Like I keep, citing back to the St. Andrews database, which, that conference, that meeting sequence has been an incredibly valuable resource for people that are developing acoustic technology. So in some ways, I think we owe it to try to pay back that benefit in knowledge and experimental data that can help promote future advances in the technology development. So we've got to figure out a way to do that. I don't know the right answer. We certainly can use help with trained analysts also validating. We've done a little bit of that. We've reached out and done a little bit of collaboration in that regard. And we've also, our analysts are increasingly trying to gain better experience and build on their experience they've gained, from their Navy, years in the Navy, being able to go through our data sets and curate and truth what's there. But we definitely need help from the academic and federal labs to help do that well. So I don't know what the answer is, but I'm definitely on board with, we have to figure out a way to at least share some of that data to try to pay back some of the gains we've had from using these data sets to build up our own technology.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. So we've heard a lot today about all the different sensors that are being used, but what new features or capabilities would you like to be added to your sensor to enhance data collection? And what should the next generation sensors look like?
I'll build on one thing that Josh mentioned earlier, and that is just kind of doing a better job of aggregating like our acoustic observations with oceanographic measurements that are being made. Some of the oceanographic phenomena that Glenn alluded to earlier, Josh, that you've alluded to, they might influence animal distribution or behavior. They also influence acoustics, and so taking every opportunity to link those things and look for observations, covariance, as we say, is important. So just like at a minimum, something we've thought of, but we haven't quite done this before, is on these sea picket systems, there's a tow cable that goes down to the seabed, and it comes up and or not a tow cable, but a coax cable that comes up to the surface. We could be instrumenting that with CTD sensors. We could be doing continuous monitoring of temperature and density stratification, in each sea picket location. So I think there's a couple of sort of low-hanging fruit things that we can do that are obvious. might incur a little bit of cost and a little bit of engineering redesign, but the benefit, having concurrent calibrated measurements, they might lead to findings that we're not even sure we know how to define what we want to do yet, but just gathering that data in a calibrated way over time will be important. So yeah, I'd like to see some of that on our side, some more of that.
I'll just add, beyond what we've already shared, I think there's opportunities to continue to miniaturize some of the sensors that are being put on some of these vehicles, and there's incredible innovation that's happening in labs and also companies around the space that are doing that. I will put, there's an example of putting ground truth. Joe made mention of it, putting optical sensors on the gliders, for example, to verify the acoustics. That's being done by Southwest Fisheries in their Antarctic surveys of krill. Again, taking advantage of an easier scattering environment in Antarctica than up here. And then one other thing is the capabilities of the platform itself. The opportunity I mentioned, backseat driver in the past, there is a tremendous amount of opportunity to put some smarts on the glider so you can take the dumb pilots out. The dumb pilot, me, not our pilots. Our pilots are great. But to continually have the glider be reactive. And so I see that as an area of innovation.
Yeah, and I would just chime in too that Joe made the good point about bringing together these technologies, and so often we're doing projects where we're using our one technology we talked about today, but for example, having a glider during a survey where we have whales tagged, then we would have much better sort of real-time environmental variables to go with the data that help with a lot of the interpretation that then could feed into models to think about what's going to be happening in other habitats in the future. And so I think bringing those things together is something that is starting to happen, and before it was sort of maybe cost prohibitive, and so it hadn't happened before. So that I think is a really exciting way forward.
Okay. I think that's it. That's all we have time for. But thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you all for great questions.
So we have a quick 15-minute break, and then the next two sessions will be starting.